Alan Paton is the head of Science Collections Department at Kew, which includes the Herbarium, the Fungarium, the Spirit Collections, Economic Botany Collection, the Seed Collections, DNA and Tissue Bank, Micromorphological Slide Collections, and related digital collections. So he's a very busy man. So thank you for your time today, Alan. He oversees collection management policies and procedures to ensure that the collections are well curated and accessible to support research in key questions for plant and fungal science. His own research focuses on mechanisms to increase access and use the collections, and on the taxonomy and systematics of the Lamiaceae, particularly basils and allies. So yeah, thank you for coming, Alan. I won't eat into your time any further.
Okay, hopefully you can see that. Yeah. Okay, first a word of thanks to my co-authors. China Williams is our senior policy advisor specialising in the Convention Biological Diversity and Access and Benefit Sharing. Sonia leads our CITES team, and Sharon is our seed bank collections manager, and she provided some information for our plant health bit. Okay, brief overview. So these areas are quite large, so I'm going to concentrate on the things that cause me most problems as a collection manager. For each of these three things, the CBD, CITES, and plant health, I'm going to concentrate mainly in the first two and a little bit about plant health at the end. I'll give a brief introduction to the background of those legal frameworks. And then in the second half of each bit, I will say a little bit about implementation and the issues which arise. Okay, so starting off Convention Biological Diversity, began in 1992, and it's got three objectives: conservation of biodiversity, sustainable use of biodiversity, and to share the benefits of that use fairly and equitably. The process is that there is a convention of parties, a meeting, a conference of parties, rather. The last one was in December 22, so we're into sessional just now. And between sessions, next one's in 24, I think. And between the sessions, the parties discuss through various sub-conferences issues and develop the framework for legislation on those issues during those meetings, and then they're approved annually, approved at each COP meeting. So the CBD has 196 parties, nearly every country in the world and the European Union. There are very few exceptions: the Vatican, Andorra, Spanish Sahara, and this strange country called the United States of America that no one's ever heard of. Just because it's not a member of the CBD does not mean that it doesn't have access legislation. It does, and we do attend. So very often the US will have laws which enforce the major decisions of the CBD. So, access and benefit sharing. It sets out a framework for sustainable use, essentially, and it provides incentive to conserve and to use. It's implemented, these framework legislations like the CBD are implemented by national laws. So each country interprets the convention and produces their national laws to govern, in this case, access and benefit sharing. So three important things which will run through this introduction and policy. You need to get prior informed consent from the provider country to use genetic resources collected. So you have to say in front what you're collecting and why you want to collect it and how you're going to use it. There will be mutually agreed terms, often in the form of a permit, sometimes as a material transfer agreement, or some other form of agreement. So you'll often hear these two principles called pick and mat. And finally, as a result of accessing information, we have to share benefits arising from that use. That can be commercial, although in our context, in our domain, it's actually usually non-commercial. It's things like training, co-publication, hosting students, identification, publications, that kind of thing. But it can be commercial. So the convention was developed in 1992 at a time when the digital world was less advanced, and there was always an object, and there was always an object to attach material to, and agreements. So you go, this person has collected this thing in this country and has undertaken to do these things. And when they send it off to somewhere else, those agreements can follow the material. However, over the last 20 years, so between the time of 92 and about 2010, it was recognized the world had moved on, and access increasingly isn't just physical. Think about things like DNA, and you don't need a lot of material. And there's a much more higher emphasis on open access to information. So this bilateral contract based on individual items is a bit outdated and really doesn't affect the changing world. So this led to the development of the Nagoya Protocol, which was really an attempt to enforce compliance. So if you access something, benefits should be shared. And the fear was, with some of those modern developments, that this wouldn't happen. So it's implemented in different ways, again, according to national law. So parties might implement access requirements of formal structures to gain access to the genetic resources of that country. The UK doesn't. It normally delegates to landowners. There are some exceptions, but generally that's the case. And parties must introduce compliance measures. Now, the UK has done this, and we'll come back to that later. About 140 parties to Nagoya Protocol, and you can find out about them in this very useful site, Access and Benefit Sharing Clearinghouse. I'm going to figure out some way to make these slides available so you can use the links and save you having to write down links all the time during the talk. So I'll try and get these slides out to you. So the Access Clearinghouse tells you about who to contact in country, what laws are in position, that kind of thing. It's a very useful tool. So because it's implemented by national law, it's not one size fits all. The scope of access can vary in different countries. Sometimes it includes ex situ collections, sometimes it's just wild, sometimes it includes material from the databases, for example. And the scope of the genetic resource, sometimes derivatives of the primary genetic resource are included. And the definition of utilization can change depending on in the country in question. So all of this is set out in individual national legislations, the permits that these countries provide, and any agreements. Usually there is a kind of compliance measure. You have to keep track on that material, and obviously benefit sharing will also be part of those agreements. So the problem for collection managers is to work out what's utilization. So this is the protocol definition, which I don't find particularly helpful, but basically you can, if you begin to play around with genetic resources and develop something novel, it's utilization, but simply using it as determined and not really trying to exploit that material, it's not utilization. So fortunately, the EU and adopted by Europe has given us a little bit more guidance, and it really emphasizes that you're trying to provide utilization under Nagoya Protocol means looking at characteristics of the genetic resource which benefit further processes. So generally, you can describe things, you can sequence something, or you can describe a species. And that's really, or you can even authenticate, say, yes, this is this thing, or it's not. That's just using the natural features of the thing to describe it or to prove what it is. The minute you start looking at functions and developing increased functionality or studying that functionality, it really creeps into utilisation in the sense of the UK implementation of the Nagoya Protocol. So at that point, you have to be aware that you may have to make due diligence declarations, which we'll come on to in a minute. I should say that other countries in access legislation who are not members of the protocol may still ask for similar things in their agreements with you. So it's not just about the Nagoya Protocol, it's about the national legislation of the particular country. So what would the UK government want to check us on and make sure we're doing? It has to be legally collected. We've got prior informed consent. We've got mutually agreed terms. We should have paperwork to demonstrate that. I'll come on to a little bit of details about what a declaration is in a second. But we have to make declarations to the Office of Product and Safety Standards. And the OPSS, as it's called, are actually beginning to do spot checks in institutions and follow up. So we're kind of moving from an introductory phase into an actual implementation phase now. So you may find that you have more requests from OPSS to provide information. So in the UK, the legislation is not retroactive, so it has to be something which was collected later in October 2014. Actually, it's slightly later than that because UK law didn't come in force until early 2015, but I kind of usually think of it as October 2014 as a start date. And it only applies to access and material from countries who were party to the Nagoya Protocol and had access legislation at the time of access. So the other thing is it has to be in receipt of research funding. Usually it's in the form of a grant. If it's not in a grant, strictly speaking, at the first trigger, you don't need to report it. But if you're developing products, you will have to report it at the second stage of notification. I think for museums, the first one is probably the most common. And normal, well, not. So core activities usually miss out the first trigger because we're not funded by a grant. But you may have commercial activities working your collection, so you'll just end up with the second trigger. But no, the important thing here is to note there's two triggers and two different forms of due diligence reporting. So the sorts of things which are causing us problems are synthetic biology. We used to have an object, we knew there was a material and we could pull out a compound for it. This is an example of stevia, a sugar substitute. We took the gene from the plant, we looked at the gene and made a synthetic sugar. And other sorts of things is digital sequence information, which is obviously incredibly useful, but also some countries see this as a threat to sharing benefits in that people could derive commercial products simply from the sequence. So I'm not going to go too much into digital sequence information because it's currently under negotiation, but and hopefully we'll come to some form of agreement at the next COP. But the thing to notice is some countries already have restrictions on the use of digital sequence information. And again, it comes back to national law, and you do have to check the national law if you've got material from that country, which you have collected since October 2014. So the problem, as I said before, is the traditional system is bilateral. It's very closely tied to a single object. That's less good model for handling genetic information. So we're looking at things like a kind of more multilateral system to deal with it. Watch this space. So what do we actually do about all this melange of various different national laws. So first of all, remember, we should have prior informed consent, we should have mutually agreed terms, we should be benefit sharing, we have to follow a national law. And it's not just a Nagoya Protocol. Other countries not parties may well have access laws, which you have to. So basic principle is that you get material legally, you keep the terms linked to it, you use it, you share benefits from that use. And if you transfer it on, you transfer the terms under which you collected it. So drawing from some experience from what we do at Q, any material coming in from fieldwork or from exchange must be legally acquired according to national law. So we should have evidence of that, whether it's permits or material transfer agreements. That acquisition will have terms around it, and it may have benefit sharing terms, it may have use, like we can't transfer it to third parties or whatever. So we have to record those restrictions. And we have to log it. We have to have a record of it. And we have to know what things are linked to it. So we've just changed the collection management system so we can now take photocopies of the permit and link them to the object. So we'll have a record of that permit. Before we had that, we didn't, and it was a real difficulty because we had any tracking back from object to the initial paperwork was a long manual process. So hopefully that will speed up going forward for us. So that's our records management system. We also do a little bit proactive stuff because of you have to kind of do a due diligence statement for grant-funded research. When grant proposals go in, we ask, are you likely to be accessing material for the purposes of research and development using the definition? And that gives us an early warning that if the project's funded, we may have to do a due diligence statement on that material. So there's a lot of kind of thinking ahead before the issues actually arise, as far as you can. Similarly, we have various staff policies and guides, but one of the most important is if somebody goes abroad to collect, we record our intended benefit sharing and make sure we've got permits. And when they come back, we try and enforce a single point of entry. So if there's no permits, they don't get the material. And having that kind of rigor to try and make sure that you can always tie up the agreements with the paper. It's good. So just a little bit in due diligence support, and it's not everything. The material has to come from a party. It has to be accessed after October 2014. Country has to have access laws. Grant funded. And utilisation has to happen in UK. And that link it below will give you a whole bunch of information about how we implement due diligence and the Nagoya Protocol in the UK. Just a slight warning, things are changing. Compliance is getting stricter. People are getting caught out. A couple of examples there. So I'm not going to talk through that. I'll keep it in the slides so you can peruse at your own time. It's exciting stuff. It'll keep you, for these nights that you can't sleep, this is the place to go. Okay, we move on to CITES. So like CBD, it's an international convention established earlier, over 153 countries. Implemented in UK law, CITES again implemented by national law, and it regulates, monitors the trade in plants considered threatened or likely to become threatened, and it's aiming to prevent unsustainable exploitation. So the regulated flora and appendices we'll talk a bit more about that, but note in the UK law, the four annexes are the same. The first three are the same as appendices 1, 2, and 3 in CITES. And you link in the middle there, you can work out what's on what appendix. We'll say a little bit more about that. Yeah, and there's some guidance. So things covered by CITES are listed, is the important point. And you can check the listing to see if it's covered or not. So CITES covers about 40,000 species, but 34,000 are plants. There are one or two animals which get all the attention, like elephants and rhinos, whales, but 34,000 plants are on the list. And these are some of the categories which are most commonly listed. Things which are traded, medicinal plants, as well as high-profile groups like orchids and cactus, which are traded a lot. So these are the appendices. Appendix A is the most restrictive, essentially threatened with extinction, and it's effectively prohibited. B, you can trade, but you need certificates, so you need to demonstrate that the trade is okay and isn't going to further harm the indigenous population. And C and D are essentially monitoring devices, so that things which people are worried about, we can gather evidence. Appendix D is things which the UK or EU might want to regulate but are not covered by CITES. So things covered in the Habitats Directive, for example, might appear on Appendix D, and a few other things that government might be interested in monitoring. So fortunately, there's two good sources to work out what's covered and what's not covered, Species Plus and the CITES website itself. Note for plants there are often annotations which affect the details of how parts of plant which are restricted or not. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. So this is welcome to Species Plus. Nice thing about this, you can query by common name, stick in mahogany. You get a whole bunch of mahoganies which are covered in CITES. You can click in them and get details. So Species Plus is really nice. The CITES website is a little bit more concave. Things are listed taxonomically, but you can see here this is the Lactaceae rating, most of them in Appendix 2 or Annex B. And there's an annotation, and this is a typical annotation which says, all parts and diversities are included and fall under CITES, but here's some exceptions. So implementation. In the UK, in the convention, every country has a management authority and a scientific authority, which gives advice to the management authority. Q is the scientific authority for the flora, and GNCC is for animals. And AFA, part of DEFA, are the management authority. So who are a part of DEFA which deal with this. So under normal circumstances, to move any CITES regulated plants, you must apply for a permit for AFA. There are exceptions which I'll come to in the end. It's implemented through our national law, Wildlife and Trade Regulations 2018. Wildlife trade regulations require both an import permit and an export permit. Not every country needs an import permit. So one of the things you have to do is check when you're sending something or you're expecting to receive something overseas that they know about import permits. Note, Northern Ireland, for the purposes of CITES and for plant health, are outside the UK, and therefore CITES regulations and permits may apply. And there's some advice, there's a link there for the website. Just note that you have to bring things through a designated port, and Eurostar is not designated. Come back to that in a second. So export permits are common. Most countries will have an export permit. To import into UK, you need an export permit. for UK import, you need an import permit, and it should be stamped through the designated port of entry. Always check in advance, particularly if you're receiving something and people think they've got the export permit and not the import permit. That can cause a huge bunch of problems. It is best to do it through an intermediary like Royal Mail or one of the courier companies, because they always send it through and the designated ports, and it can be checked. If you are carrying it by hand, you can declare it in border, but you must have an import permit in advance, which will get stamped at that point. And this website down below will give you more information on the details. So if you don't have the permits, or even one of the permits, you can't do accession material because of in breach of UK law. So it's really important you plan ahead and think about getting your permits. There are not uncommonly people send us things which don't realise you need an import permit. So again, try and, if you know somebody's sending you stuff, do let them know about this. The Registered Scientific Institution network is a help in this regard, and I'll come to that later. Yeah, if you don't have the permits, the material can be seized, certainly detained. And if you don't have it, if you don't have the correct paperwork, you should declare it to Border Force, and they can look at it and make a decision what to do with the material. So the common exemptions for relevant to collections. Some material are pre-convention and therefore not covered. Exhibitions, there are ways around that, and registered scientific institutions. The decision to issue permits lies with the management authority. In our case, it's AFA. So you do need to talk to AFA if you are trying to use one of those exemptions. And I'm quite happy to talk to you. So there's the link if you need to talk to AFA about your license. And you can get waivers. Again, this has to be negotiated with AFA, or you have to request from AFA. But if you're just bringing one thing, you're not a registered institution, this is something you should be aware of, because you have to pay for permits. So CITES registered institutions allows research institutions to register with their management authority. If you're using a scheme, both sending and receiving institutions must be part of the management CITES registration system. The bundles carry a label which clearly states that it is part of that system, but it's not a backdoor. The material has to be accessioned into collections. It has to be for research, and records must be kept. At the end of the year, we have to report, if you have brought things in through this system, you do have to report that to them, to AFA annually. So it's important that you kind of keep records of the material which is coming in. You should keep records of CITES material anyway, so you can link it to its permits and demonstrate that it came in legally. And there's some useful references which you can go and find out more about. I'm doing for time. All right. I just wanted to mention a little bit in plant health, because this is tightening up with various things like outbreaks of ash dieback and various other tree diseases. Herbarium specimens are exempt, but not everyone knows this. And you may get requests if you're sending something abroad, or somebody sending you things might say, can I get a phytosanitary certificate? You can't get a phytosanitary certificate for herbarium specimens because they're exempt. So they come in without material. This can cause problems because for a while, I'm not sure if this is still the case, but we couldn't send anything to Japan because Japan legislation said you had to have a phytosanitary certificate, so we couldn't get one, so we couldn't send the material. So it can cause problems. So it's really important you check with the country you're sending to what the legislation is. Sometimes it requires phytosanitary certificates for the material. Sometimes it's some form of notification. And remember, sending material under CITES or Plant Health, Northern Ireland has special conditions. So this can go wrong. This was a case, Paris sent just over 100 specimens to Australia, including types from 1791, and most of the material was mid-19th century, and it was incinerated on arrival because it didn't have the correct paperwork, which amongst other things caused the Australians to review their processes, but also the Australian ambassador was summoned to the presidential palace in Paris to be giving a bollocking for destroying French patrimony. You could argue, of course, it was Australian patrimony in the first place, but either way, this was a big political rumpus. And although I think the Australians have clarified things, they are actually one of the best countries for telling you what you have to do in advance. So they should have checked with Australia what was required before we sent the material. And Australian institutions are usually very good at telling you what's coming up. But Australia is not the only country who has quite strict laws on import. So just be aware that there can be issues about sending things due to plant health reasons, which can be quite serious, as in this case. So nearly all plants and unprocessed plant products have some form of control. There's very few unregulated materials, but you can check. This website will tell you what's in and what category it falls into, and whether it's prohibited or not. You can import prohibited, but you need a scientific research license to do so. And these are issued by AFA on behalf of DEFRA. And it works for a process. The license is site specific. It means that you have got a standard operating procedure for dealing with the material. It travels under the letter of authority, which allows it to come in as an exemption under plant health legislation. And any material coming in needs to be carefully recorded. You have to keep records of it. If a material comes in with a letter of authority, then it is under license, so it has to stay in licensed premises. And for living material, that means it's almost certainly going to stay in a quarantine facility until it is inspected. I've got probably less important for the museums, but certainly for research institutions, separate licenses are required for things like soil, living plants, and our herbarium for samples of pathogenic fungi have their own license, which specifies what we can do with it. If we actually want to do work on the pathogenic nature of the fungi, we will need a special separate license to do that, because we've just got a license to hold the material. Okay, so there's some links on for future information and study, just to give you a bit of background, which is useful. Just note that increasingly some countries require a economic operators registration and identification number on the outside of their parcel. And you may find yourself getting asked for that. Your institution probably has one. It's probably owned by your finance department, but you may get a request for that. And if you can get one, it just kind of demonstrates that you're an actual business and it's commonly required for import. Okay, so conclusions. If you forget everything else in this talk, think ahead. Think about what you're bringing in or what you might be sending out. Think about where it's going. Think about the fact that national legislation is different in different countries and you may need to find things out. So don't rush, plan ahead and ask for advice when you need it. The agencies who enforce this are usually pretty good at giving advice. Thank you. Let me stop.
Right, wonderful. Thank you, Alan. If you stop sharing your screen, and then I will feel less disconcerted.
Yeah. Can you share? How do I stop sharing? Oh, got it. I can see it. Sorry.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So much to think about. Does anybody have any questions? Oh yeah, Holly has her hand up. Oh wait, no, that's just me with my hand on something. No, Holly doesn't have a hand up. Would anybody like to ask a question of Alan? There was an enormous amount to think of.
Yes, I may, if I may.
Yep, please do.
I just want to say, well, thank you for pointing out that Northern Ireland seems to be exceptional in this whole process. So I guess that we are more in line then with the procedures that Dublin would have to follow. Is that right from your perspective?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I would check because it's definitely not, and I'm definitely not an expert in Northern Ireland.
No, sure.
But yeah, I would think so.
I'm grateful
it's
at least
kind
that
of-
you've drawn attention to that, because I hadn't actually kind of realized that. So that was really valuable. Thank you.
Yeah, you can always ask for things like CITES and Botany Health. AFA will help you. For CBD, for the Nagoya enforcement stuff, I'm fairly sure it's the same as the rest of the UK.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Oh, can't hear you, Laura.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. Does anybody else have any questions? I'm kind of quite glad that I have a small local collection, and I don't, like, all of that stuff sounds
So
very.
if we can figure out a way of putting these slides someplace, that'd be good, because I think a lot of information you can get from those links I put in the slides.
Yeah, we'll have a look at perhaps saving it on the NatSCA website or something like that, or perhaps just taking the links out, and we'll figure something out so that the talk is available. I mean, aside from being recorded, so that, yeah, like you said, people can click the links and everything. Any other questions? I was just busy scribbling. I was just like, oh God, there's a lot. But yeah, like you said, you can ask Alan questions, later. Sometimes I know it's difficult to kind of think on the spot sometimes. Right.
Sorry, Laura, I do have a question for Alan. Sorry, I couldn't see how to raise my hand. Alan, thanks. In your experience, working with other countries, have you found that if you're dealing with plants prior to 2014, is that an understood concept? Is like, if you've got earlier collections from that country, in your experience, are they sort of lumping it all together now with this prior informed consent?
So I think it really depends which country you're in, because some laws, say Brazil, are deliberately retroactive. Under Brazilian law, if you looked at a material you collected in Edinburgh from 1858 and sampled it, you would be, under Brazilian law, accessing it today. So you would be covered under Brazilian legislation. Except we're not in Brazil, we're in the EU. Or sorry, we're not in the EU anymore, unfortunately. We're in the UK. So you're perfectly entitled to use material from Brazil pre-2014, 2015. However, you have to be cognizant of the fact that that would be illegal under Brazilian law. And I think for institutions like us, we have to bear in mind that we cannot be seen as a backdoor around countries' legislation. So whereas you might take the decision to use an old Brazilian material from Edinburgh or from Kew for a particular use and not declare it, if you had a request for 400 Brazilian specimens from Brazil to, say, China for some form of study, even if it was taxonomic grounds, we would normally say, no, you should go to Brazil to request that material if you're doing sampling.
Yeah.
We don't mind sending it in loan because technically a loan is not a transfer. It's, you know, you're still controlling it. You can still, in theory, prevent sampling. So you do have to be kind of aware of those things. Again, this is kind of like a case for where partnerships are really important and understanding where the sensitivities lie within other countries, because we shouldn't be using the difference in national legislation to ethically not behave as we should.
Absolutely.
So
Thank you.
it is a bit of a nightmare, to be honest.
Slightly, yeah. No, I absolutely agree with you. I think you can talk about the technicality of it according to law, but actually sometimes it just comes to trust and partnerships and working in the spirit of the ABS.
Yeah.
Thanks for that, Alan.
Yeah.
Great.
There's a question, CITES labels. Well, you've imported them. So if you come in, if material comes under a CITES label, you can use it for the purposes of research. Some of that research might entail public display, but I think if you're putting it on simply an exhibition and you weren't actually doing CITES, I would probably just check with AFA it was all right. Normally, we don't actually put that many herbarium specimens on display, so we don't necessarily deal with that as an issue. But yeah, if in doubt, I would check with AFA, and there's a link on one of the slides for contacting AFA. Strictly speaking, they are for research, so you should be doing research on that material as a research tool rather than as a public engagement tool.
We have another question from Donny. Alan, the CITES permit application process has moved online as opposed to the paper applications. Have you or at Kew started to use this yet? And if so, how have you found it?
I try to avoid CITES permits as far as possible because things go wrong too commonly. So our policy is actually not to send CITES material to a non-registered institution. So I never use the permit. We have had, I believe it's changing. I'm not sure it's gone online yet. I know it is going online, but I don't know if it's actually done it. But we do get problems with permits, and part of that is because people don't recognize we need an import permit and it has to be stamped on the way in to be legal, and that causes that misunderstanding, can cause issues, and we end up having to declare things. So we try to avoid using permits wherever we can. And if we are, we try and make sure that we have got bags of time to do it. It is kind of problematic. And some countries, Some countries seem to be steering a little bit away from the registered scientific industry and going for permits. We're in one from Namibia other month, which came in with permits, and there was an issue with the import permit. So if you can, if you're frequently doing this for the purposes of research, then becoming registered is very helpful. So Deborah's been using it, so it must be live.
Deborah Beer says that she's happy to assist anyone who has any questions. Well, we've only really got a few seconds left until the next talk. Just as a hint for everyone, if you are having trouble raising your hand for questions, if you move your mouse around and the bar comes up at the bottom, you'll see reactions that has a little smiley face with a plus. If you click on that, at the bottom of that little pop-up, it says raise hand. So and then also make sure to unraise your hand when you've finished, so it doesn't keep wiggling around. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alan. That was absolutely fantastic.